Hello, I'm Stephan Schwartz. It's my pleasure to welcome you to SchwartzReport. This week, I want to talk about something that is going on in science that's not getting a lot of attention in the popular media, but which is really changing the nature of how we understand the matrix of life on Earth and the role that it plays, or the role that consciousness plays in that matrix. For much of history, humanity has believed humans were separate from the rest of creation and had dominion over the earth as if it were an exploitable bank account left to us by a rich uncle. As the Bible frames it, and God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing upon the earth." And in a sense, that is exactly how we have operated, as if we had dominion and were really a separate order from the rest of life on the earth. And unfortunately, as we are discovering with the increasing extinction of other beings and with the onset of climate change, we've done a rather poor job of it. French philosopher René Descartes in 1637 wrote, "Cogito ergo sum," I think, therefore I am. It set the tone of science when he said that only people can think. And this prevailed for centuries until Jane Goodall published her discoveries about chimpanzees in the Gombe Stream Reserve in Tanzania. And it's worth noting that Goodall was so intimidated by this materialist perspective of science, this conviction that only humans were capable of thought, that she held back from publishing some of her insights for almost 20 years. She feared that she would be accused of anthropomorphizing the chimpanzee's behavior, and she would be derided for being unscientific. But slowly this is changing as science discovers that all the beings of Earth are conscious, and that in fact we live in a matrix of consciousness in which all beings in the domain are interconnected and interdependent. I would suggest to you that this emerging post-materialist worldview is the modern equivalent of a Copernican revolution. Let me give you some examples about this. You may remember the story of a gorilla named Coco, a female gorilla whose IQ was estimated to be between 75 and 95. Now, to give you a sense of context, the average IQ in the United States is 98, with 34% of Americans between 98 and 85. So Coco was smarter than a number of American humans. Unfortunately, her anatomy did not allow her to speak. Monkeys and apes lacked the neural control over their vocal tract muscles to properly form words. But she learned sign language. You may have seen a documentary on this. And she developed a vocabulary of 1,000 words and could understand 2,000 words of human speech. Or you might remember stories about Bunny, a dog who learned to push buttons left on the floor and that he had a vocabulary of 92 words. Or another dog named Stella, who could also push buttons laid out on the floor and communicate what she wanted or her feelings about something. And there are other dogs who have learned to do this arrangement of buttons on the floor. It's known as the alternative and augmentative communications, AAC. It's used to help nonverbal children to communicate without speaking. Using the buttons, they can create sentences. They're like little buttons with a word written on the top, and they learn which button to push. And using the buttons, they can create sentences requesting something or commenting on something. And what surprises many who still talk about dumb animals is that this new line of research extends far beyond mammals like gorillas and dogs. And I want to share with you a little of this research because I want to make this point about the fact that we live in a matrix of consciousness in which all consciousness is interconnected and interdependent, and that there is an aspect of it that is about consciousness that is not limited by space-time and is not physiologically based. For instance, consider cephalopods of the ocean, the cuttlefish, the octopuses, the squids, or bees that are so essential to our own survival, because without their help, we would not be able to practice agriculture. We are beginning to realize that we are surrounded by beings of consciousness. I learned this myself in a very personal way when I was a younger man. When I got out of college, I went to work for National Geographic on one of my archaeological expeditions, this one in the Bahamas, at sea, a marine archaeology project. At night, we often moored the Seaview, the 125-foot research vessel that was our home base, just east of Riding Rock on the Bahama banks. The Riding Rock was a low limestone sliver of land with a single tree. And over the weeks, I would dive down to the sea floor because I became fascinated with the life, the whole little system that was going on at the coral reef that was a little distance away from where the boat was, the ship. And I would dive down to the seafloor and sit next to the reef where an octopus lived, who was tucked away in a space under some rocks. I didn't realize at first that he was there, but then I did see him come in one day, or come down and go into it underneath these rocks, and I realized that he lived there. So I would start going down and diving, and I would take with me a fishing rod, a fishing spear, with a piece of fish on the end to tempt it to come out. I was curious to see whether it would. And over time, I held the spear closer to the tip until in the end, I just held the fish. The octopus, who I called George, although I never really knew if it was a male or a female, never bit me. But by the time I was just holding the fish and had left the spear aside, he would come down over my hand and arm, and with one of his arms gently stroke my arm as he ate the fish. I will never forget the sense of its suckers on my wetsuit and hand. And the interesting thing is, he wouldn't come out for any of the other divers. I got a couple of other people to try this, but it didn't work. He wouldn't come out. He clearly recognized me and could distinguish me from the others, even though we all wore the same blue and gray wetsuits and had on dive masks. Roland Anderson, a biologist at the Seattle Aquarium, tested this idea of whether octopuses could recognize and distinguish individual humans. He dressed two humans in blue aquarium staff uniforms, just as we were in the same kind of wetsuits. And he had one person consistently feed the octopuses in the aquarium, while the other, when he was present, would stick at them with a bristly stick. And Anderson reported that within a week, without touching the two humans, just looking at them through the water, most of the octopuses would move toward the feeder human and away from the irritator as soon as they came into view. Now, even more extraordinary than that, let me talk about bees. Bees are essential, as I said, to our agriculture. And they're little, small insects. And yet, do you know that they can memorize flowers and human faces, that they solve problems of arithmetic and can learn to use tools? Until the last few years, it was thought that social insects were governed only by instinct. It was all nothing more than innate behaviors. But recent research tells us something very different. At Princeton, Professor Lars Chitka did research on this and explained, and this is a quote, "Much of the workings of the bee's mind can be understood only when one considers the natural challenges of the constantly changing economy in which they must operate. The pressures of operating in this setting are often expressed in terms of physical performance." Now, what does he mean by that? Well, for example, a bee can carry its own body weight in nectar or pollen, but in order to get enough, it may have to visit 1,000 flowers and fly as much as 10 kilometers to fill its honey stomach just that once. And it may have to make 100 such trips to generate a teaspoon of honey. And less appreciated are the mental efforts required along the way. I mean, in visiting 1,000 flowers, they have to know which flowers will give them the nectar, the pollen, the things that they need. The bee has to work basically 1,000 floral puzzle boxes. And they have to be able to know which to go to and which not to go to. And they learn how to do it. This is rather extraordinary when you think that a bee has this teeny tiny little brain, and yet they can figure it out. Even more extraordinary, consider monarch butterflies. When I first left university, I went to work for National Geographic, and one of the first stories that I was assigned was about the monarch butterfly. They have a brain the size of the head of a straight pin, and yet somehow, in their 2,500-mile migration from Canada and the US down to the forests of central Mexico, where they hibernate, they fly day by day. That's a long way. Think of this little insect flying, this butterfly, flying day by day, and every night they stop in the same tree that their parents stopped in. And then the next day, they fly to the next tree that their parents always stopped in for the night. And even more interestingly, if the tree falls or is cut down, they pick a new tree, and the next generation of that monarch will pick that same tree, this new tree, and so will their progeny. And they will do this generation after generation. With a brain the size of the head of a pin, how can they possibly know which direction to fly, let alone identify tree after tree as they travel 2,500 kilometers? What if these examples of consciousness seem strange and yet are real? And let me now make it even more extraordinary. Plants can think and remember, we are learning from research. And I want to stress with you that all of this is not myth, this is not casual conversation. Everything that I'm telling you is based on objectively verifiable research. And in the burgeoning field of plant neurobiology, it's a field that almost by definition seems improbable, a theory has emerged called cellular basis of consciousness, CBC, and it postulates that consciousness evolved with the very first cells and that all cellular life, of whatever form, is endowed with consciousness. One of the leading researchers in this work is Dr. František Beliska of the University of Bonn in Germany at the Department of Plant Cell Biology. He was asked by a journalist about this because it seemed so extraordinary. And he said there are numerous definitions, but the most simple and relevant is this: consciousness is a feature of living systems, allowing them awareness of their external and internal conditions, all living beings. Professor Stanislaw Karpinski from the University of Warsaw in life sciences in Poland led a team that explored the idea of plant consciousness, and found that plants do, in fact, have consciousness, and that they transmit information about light intensity and quality from leaf to leaf in a way that's very similar to our own nervous systems. These electrochemical signals are carried by cells that act as the nerves of the plant, Karpinski reported. In his experiments, he showed that light shown on one leaf caused the whole plant to respond, even though the other leaves did not get exposed to that light. And the response took the form of a light-induced chemical reactions that was passed through the leaves. This showed, he said, that the plant remembered information encoded in light. He said, we shone the light only on the bottom of the plant, and yet we observed changes in the upper part. This sort of story of consciousness being a reality for beings other than humans gets lost in the news because the reports are rarely placed in their proper context if they're covered at all. You really only find this in the academic literature. Perhaps if they were more properly covered by journalism, people would recognize how important and powerful such research findings are. Why do I say this? Because these stories collectively are telling us we need to radically and fundamentally change our view of reality. All of this research is showing us we live in a matrix of consciousness, and that all life is interconnected and interdependent. Once one's mind opens to that view, it becomes clear why new technologies must be developed that don't pollute, that don't change the ecosystems like cutting down the Amazon forest. That we understand that there are implications that affect the well-being of every creature on Earth because of our technologies, and that includes ourselves, and that all our social policies must be designed with this idea of the matrix of consciousness foremost in our consciousness. It is so simple to say, yet it's so profound in its implications. This research is also changing the minds of scientists about what we mean by consciousness, and in fact, whether it is entirely physiologically based. How can a bee with a brain of less than 2 cubic millimeters learn to count or recognize a human face? And yet we know they can. How can a monarch butterfly, whose brain has only 1 million neurons, the human brain has around 86 billion neurons, possibly know which direction to fly and to know to fly to a particular tree and a whole sequence of trees as they move from Canada and the US to Mexico? And yet we know they do, because monarchs have been tagged. That's right, they put little tags on them and tracked. And it shows that what I've just said is absolutely correct. As naturalist Dana Wilde points out, conventional depictions of cognitive capacity used to involve the physical size of a brain and the number of neurons in it just is not the proper way to calculate consciousness. We see different systems that operate in different ways, and yet collectively they are all allowing the beings to maintain a level of consciousness. Adult moths, for instance, remember pain that they experienced as caterpillars. Spiders have personality types. For instance, in the cobweb spiders, there are two kinds of females: aggressive females who participate in colony defense and prey capture, while others are docile and engage in brood care. So spiders, bugs, plants, they all have some measure of consciousness. And as we face increasing climate change results that are affecting us in dramatic ways, and we see the reports of what is happening in extinction of many species, we realize we are altering the matrix of life on Earth, and that we are going to pay a price for that. And so we have got to rethink our technologies. We have got to rethink the way we treat the other beings with whom we share this planet. And I want to leave you with this question that you ask yourself: what can I do? How can I foster well-being, not only amongst the humans, but amongst all the living beings of the earth? What can I do? How can I prosper? How can I make other beings prosper so that the earth is in balance and in well-being? Because it's one of the most important questions you're ever going to ask yourself.